Thank you very much indeed. Professor Mitula, dear colleagues, fellow panelists, let me thank the ALC and IDS for this opportunity to exchange with you today on the theme of developmental post-conflict reconstruction. It's quite a mouthful as a topic, and we haven't found an acronym to really need to be built in a very structured way around how, in the context of both the return of development to the agenda of our policymakers on the continent and the realities of conflict on the African continent, we can bring two streams of both academic work and policy action together in a creative way in order to underpin efforts at post-conflict reconstruction on the continent with a developmental anchorage that could help both redress some of the structural causes of conflict in the first instance, but over and above that, move the parameters of post-conflict policy making beyond where it has been left in most of the countries around the world, where efforts have been made to push an agenda of post-conflict reconstruction. And I think it's already a well-established it's a well-established issue that for some 25 to 30 years, in the heyday of structural adjustment, which was also incidentally the period when the African continent knew a considerable degree of turmoil, beginning with Somalia, moving on to Sierra Leone, Liberia, and other parts of the continent where conflict broke out in a fairly spectacular manner, some of it degenerating into prolonged, almost anarchical civil war, but in others, low-intensity conflicts that have persisted to this day. And we'll talk of Casamance, for example, in Senegal, which is not considered to be a full-scale civil war, but nevertheless a conflict that has persisted, or in the Niger Delta of Nigeria, around which several colleagues here have worked considerably. Now, during that same period, we had international policymakers, mostly congregated in multilateral institutions, pronouncing the death of development, essentially because of the triumph of neoliberal market-based ideas that were formulated into a so-called Washington Consensus and built on the doctrine, not so much even just an ideology, but a doctrine of market liberalization in a unidirectional manner that suggested that what was understood to be the main pillars of development making in the period up to the 1980s no longer applied and didn't even have any prospect of being restored. It was Paul Krugman, in fact, who, in the context of the debates of the 1980s and 1990s, described the Washington Consensus as nothing short of a counter-revolution in development thinking, in the way in which it was set up in the post-war period, with the emergence of Keynesianism and the various ideas of state-led development. The reduction of the state in the Washington Consensus to little more than a night watchman role, essentially to create what was described as the enabling environment to allow the market to flourish, became essentially the established doctrine around which much of policy making was undertaken. And Africa became easily the biggest playground and experimental site for all of the ideas of the neoliberal policy community. Several of us did work around these issues. Adjustment in economics is supposed to be part of the experience of economies, given the cyclical nature of capitalism, the boom-bust character of capitalism. And when you make an adjustment, it is understood to be a temporary diversion from development, not a permanent state of things. And what the Washington Consensus attempted to do which led Paul Krugman to talk of a counter-revolution in the discipline of economics, was essentially to reduce what was supposed to be a temporary diversion into the permanent objective of policy itself, and hence also the triumphal proclamation of the death of development and all of what was associated with it. Of course, naturally, in the context of this, as conflicts, some of them, quite frankly, not unconnected to contestations of structural adjustment or the consequences flowing from structural adjustment with the IMF riots, sometimes degenerating into organized opposition that ultimately led to challenges to centralized governmental authority or challenges to the post-independence nation-state building project on the continent. Effectively, what countries which went into conflict and came out of some kind of resolution through the peacekeeping arrangements that were put in place were then compelled to do was precisely to adopt the Washington Consensus policies. So that as you sought to rebuild Sierra Leone and Liberia, you did so within the parameters of a macroeconomic framework that by definition was anti-developmental. Inflation was described as public enemy number one. You would expect that in the context of reconstructing a conflict society, macroeconomic policy would aim, if not to be expansive, at least at a minimum to be accommodative in a way that will allow for important investments to be made both in infrastructure and in welfare. And the exact opposite was what took place. In place of development, therefore, we had the growth of humanitarianism, which has gone in all kinds of directions ever since then. Humanitarianism supplanted development, and international NGOs attempted to supplant the state, being the bearers and drivers of humanitarianism. So you had all of the, okay, I don't want to be subversive, but Oxfams and the like of them becoming the new big actors in the field. And to a great extent also the United Nations certainly just joined the bandwagon and became part of the humanitarian train. Behave yourself, Adedeji. Sorry? Yeah, I mean, yeah. Right. I'm supposed to be working for the United Nations, so. But I'm an African. So at the end of the day, you have basically a parameter of post-conflict reconstruction that was set up, which in fact was anti-developmental and reduced the entire space of policy making to the management of humanitarian emergencies and the resettlement of internally displaced people. But the key questions, if you took the case of Sierra Leone, part of the crisis before Sierra Leone was a severe problem of governance that was compounded or which manifested itself by one of the most spectacular levels of youth unemployment. In a certain sense, the rest of Africa began to experience, say, dimensions of youth unemployment on a scale which Sierra Leone already knew several years before. And sometimes we don't remember that Sierra Leone was actually, in 1979, the first country after the OAU 78 summit or so, signed the first agreement with the IMF for the opening salvos of structural adjustment. And so essentially, questions have been asked, and that's why I said informally we have spoken amongst ourselves as Africans to say, but this model of post-conflict reconstruction, which does not put development at the center, and the key questions of employment creation, of restoring the productive base of economies, of beginning to add value domestically, and which simply reduces intervention from the international community to humanitarian emergencies of various kinds and the resettlement of internally displaced people. There has to be something fundamentally wrong with it. And if you look at even the agency of the United Nations, which is charged with the responsibility for driving development. If the World Bank abdicated its own responsibilities in the name of Washington Consensus, even going against its founding vision and principle to go along with the IMF and the Treasury Department of the United States, what excuse did the UNDP, as an organization that was set up and whose legitimacy is to be the driver of development, have in being part of a post-conflict reconstruction framework, which essentially helped to give fillip to the Washington Consensus. And we can give many examples of the difficulties if you look at the direct role that the UNDP took in Timor-Leste, for example. Essentially, it was basically managing austerity with an overemphasis on issues of law and order, to some extent of rights defined in a very liberal framework, but bereft of the socioeconomic rights that sometimes are usually at the heart of crisis in the first instance and are written out of effective responses to post-conflict reconstruction. Well, development was proclaimed to be dead. Soon after, the neoliberal framework itself went into crisis. The chickens came home to roost. For as long as crisis in the neoliberal system was confined to countries other than those of the G7 countries, we had all kinds of explanation as to why those conflicts occurred. In Africa, we had episodes of failures of the market repeatedly that took place, and it was blamed either on the absence of a proper governance framework. Remember the famous expression, there can be no Hamlet without the Prince of Denmark. Structural adjustment without governance in Africa was a mistake. So give Africans governance, good governance, to complement structural adjustment. Then the social dimensions of adjustment, which were neither social nor really dimensional, insofar as they were lacking in any serious, it basically was propaganda to save structural adjustment, when UNICEF especially cried out about the need for adjustment with a human face. And the Bretton Woods institutions found it difficult to dismiss their African critics as people who are simply engaging in rabble-rousing. And UNICEF showed statistically that all kinds of difficulties with maternal and child health, for example, historic gains of independence in the social domain being completely rolled back. Subsequently, we were told that maybe our problem was that we were immersed in a political economy of affection. Africans, you know, you own one chicken, you get a visitor, you slaughter the chicken. And then you own nothing. You don't have assets. So maybe you needed to adopt a certain Calvinist ethos. And this was quite serious. I mean, Pierre Landell-Mills, who was the head of the governance program of the World Bank at the time, a Canadian, wrote a piece actually that maybe what distinguished Africa from Asia, which was the darling of the bank in their interpretation of the East Asian miracle, was basically that there was a certain Confucian ethics in Asia which Africa did not have. There was Confucius. And Confucius, if you decoded, was really not too different from Calvinism. And since Calvinism served Europe right in terms of accumulation and all of the ethos of public service, Confucius did the same thing for Asia. Where is the African equivalent? And I remember saying to him that maybe we should all then become Buddhists and Confucians and Taoists in order to maybe in Africa begin to have the chance of overcoming the difficulties. So excuses were given about the framework not working, not because the framework itself was wrong, but because the Africans somehow were lacking something. And when it hit Asia, it was the same thing. Remember, the East Asian crisis of 97, 98. And Suharto fell. The only person who really survived it was Mahathir in Malaysia, who basically suspended all of the neoliberal policies that Malaysia had adopted, particularly capital, the liberalization of the capital account of the country, and you know, all of the fights that took place around it subsequently. But essentially, we were again told that, yeah, I mean, East Asia, which was the darling up to that point, was mired in all kinds of neo-patrimonialism. And no shortage of scholars to generate literature about neo-patrimonialism in Africa and Asia, Thomas Carnegie, for example, was to describe neo-patrimonialism as that particularly Zairian disease, looking at why the state of things in the Congo was as it was. And he said, no, I mean, just as in other parts of the developing world where neo-patrimonial regimes had dominated the political terrain, Zaire was a disease of that country, and extended to the rest of the continent. Neo-patrimonialism as a problem. Only when it came to hit home. I can give you examples also of the discourse on Latin America about the crisis. We had the meltdown of currencies in Argentina, in Brazil, and the collapse of the Mexican model, which was praised at a certain point as being indicative of the benefits of the neoliberal framework. When it collapsed, again, all kinds of explanations were given, short of the contradictions within the model itself. 2007, 2008, as Obama was about to be sworn in, the American economy was melting down, subprime, and those who preached neoliberalism suddenly started discovering Keynes and Marx all over again. Bestsellers in the US, Milton Keynes, Karl Marx, Das Kapital. They wanted to understand what was happening to their system. And I actually said that it would be interesting for us to do a study of a tale of two adjustments, because the same people who said to us, this is what you must do in the face of crisis, began to do the exact opposite of what they preached to us. Where they told us, privatize, commercialize, or liquidate public enterprises that were not performing, they moved in to create the concept of too big to fail. Where they said, devalue your damn currency until it is devalued into meaninglessness, which was the lot of many African countries. We suddenly were told that, again, we are going to be doing, they didn't call it devaluation. They didn't call it printing of money. They called it quantitative easing. You find a very technical, and the British are very good at that, actually. They invent these things. And it actually took the intervention of the Times of London and the Economist magazine to say to the governor of the Bank of England, stop the chase. What you are doing is simply printing of money, and you have printed 60 billion pounds to save Lloyds TSB and Halifax and all of those banks that were in trouble. For them to admit that, yeah, actually it's true, we are printing money, but it's different from Mugabe's printing of money. That was the caveat, right? So at the end of the day, what was celebrated as the death of development came full cycle, and somehow development has come back to the agenda. But it has come back to the agenda in a manner in which it has not yet, in my understanding, and I stand to be corrected, sufficiently been infused into thinking about post-conflict reconstruction. We continue to be caught in a model of post-conflict reconstruction which runs parallel to the discourses about how to reconquer the development terrain, and over and above that, make it the defining principle, the linchpin around which other policy interventions are then structured, including the management of low-intensity conflicts and cases of outright state rebuilding, nation rebuilding, and the revival of economies in a context where wholesale conflict had burst out in the past. And what I hope we would be doing with the ALC in the coming years would be to both generate knowledge around this, do a systematic critique of including existing models of peacekeeping, because essentially, again, unhappy is the country which goes into conflict and which has to find itself under UN peacekeeping operations. And I tell you, I go to a place like Mali and pick up a newspaper next door to Senegal, where I'm based, and Malians are complaining every day that these guys are on an extended holiday. At the slightest sound of a gun in Kidal, the UN immediately gathers its own. Those who came to provide protection for the natives begin by protecting themselves. And you ask yourself, what is the entire purpose? The structure of expenditure, what resources are used on within UN peacekeeping operations, even the whole system of governance, which is interconnected with the politics of donors, at a time when the UN itself has become perhaps the most donorized institution in the world. I mean, very few are the agencies of the UN that can do anything meaningful without a group of 12 to 15 donors being behind them. And basically, the donors have puzzled the UN agencies amongst themselves. DFID controls who, USAID controls who, the Danes, the Norwegians, and the Swedes, God bless them for their sweet-spiritedness, but basically they are sympathetic undertakers. They also control a few of those agencies. And so basically you find across the continent that all peacekeeping operations are run by personnel who are basically appointed on the basis of a certain donor logic. And in terms of the kinds of conversations and interfaces that they ought to be having with local communities, there's a complete absence of it, to a point where the current head of the UN mission in Mali finds it absolutely impossible to sit in conversation with the elected president of the country, let alone with the cabinet to talk about how to reconstruct the country. There is no meeting point between them. So we do have important academic challenges from this point of view, to areas around which we can build concrete research initiatives, but also areas of serious policy engagement, where we can in fact begin to say to at least key planning officials in countries that are in post-conflict reconstruction on the continent, that there is another way of thinking of reconstruction, which goes beyond humanitarianism and which does not, in a certain way, idealize liberal rights to the exclusion of the key socioeconomic challenges to which policy must respond if reconstruction itself is to open a new path for legitimate governance of our political spaces. So these are some of my random thoughts, Chair, and I thank you for the opportunity to share them.
Thank you very much, Bayo. They are not random. We are about to really take serious issues with them and discuss.
You can,
Yeah, sure.
Is it okay if I say
Sure,
yes, I'll
sure,
work from-
sure. Feel free to, so long as we can hear you.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm worried that Professor Lukosi has said many of the things I would like to have said, and far more eloquently than I'm going to manage. So I'm going to try just to, add to that, since the aim of this is to generate discussion with everyone. So let me start by saying already that, of course, as many of us know, I think the dominant interpretation of peace building when we're thinking about post-conflict reconstruction as part of that peace-building agenda is linked to the liberal peace thesis. And by that, what do I mean? It's effectively rooted in political and economic liberalization. So a variety of, policy frameworks, but as part of that, especially thinking about post-conflict reconstruction that centers on marketization and market-oriented policies. And by that, I mean, private sector leadership, thinking about the fact that you have to have a small government, thinking about fiscal prudence, or I would say exaggerating fiscal prudence, thinking about liberalized trade and prioritizing foreign direct investment, thinking about the fact that many of these post-conflict states are forced to prioritize debt repayments as well. So these are the sort of policy frameworks that, the sort of policies that dominate the space when we think about post-conflict reconstruction today. And as part of that, also very essential partnerships of key international finance institutions, such as the World Bank and the IMF. And with regard to that, if we think about the UN Peacebuilding Commission, for instance, whose work also includes post-conflict reconstruction, there you see a requirement for the membership of these institutions. And in fact, you see these institutions steering the way that they think about post-conflict reconstruction. So some general critiques about this approach to post-conflict reconstruction. The fact that you have policy frameworks that are treated as though one size fits all. So you have a set of criteria for international development assistance allocations that have just a set of policies that are applied in the same way to a variety of
of context, regardless of the particular situation you're thinking about. So as part of that, of course, you have a very top-down approach. Now, this really challenges these very fragile environments. You're talking about post-conflict environments where quite often you're thinking about fledgling democracies, fledgling governance structures, and yet you are imposing a set of policies, and if you like, undermining a fledgling social a fledgling process of building a social contract between the government and its people. Another critique of this is the fact that many of these policies really don't deal with the real sectors of the economy. And I think, as was said earlier, this kind of humanitarian approach to things. So thinking very much about a short-termist way of thinking about what the next steps ought to be. And then I think perhaps most importantly, you're looking at situations where there's an unproven premise. It's very difficult to think about a situation where these policy frameworks have been applied and things have actually worked out well. I'll cite 3 examples. East Timor was already mentioned. But for instance, when we look at East Timor, where these policy frameworks were actually applied very stridently, you find on the one hand celebrations about the fact that you have a growth in external reserves that were generated, because East Timor also has substantial oil and gas resources. But there you also find a situation where you have increases in the poverty rate. And you have to think that this is in a post-conflict environment where everything is really quite delicate. And you're trying to address a situation where you're trying to also avoid a return to conflict. You also have this promotion of privatization strategies, regardless of the context you're dealing with. So again, in East Timor, you have a situation where foreign capital is really promoted, is really encouraged. And I know at the present time you have a very tenuous situation between East Timor and Australia because of certain agreements that were signed, giving Australia access to its oil and gas resources. And now East Timor, in the light of day, is trying to get out of those arrangements because they're well aware that those arrangements are not in the interest of their people, and it becomes very difficult to get out of this. What does that do to the social contract that this fledgling nation is trying to put in place? Sierra Leone also was mentioned earlier, and there, in present times, you have a celebration about the growth rate, the economic growth rate in Sierra Leone. But when you unpack that, you find a situation where that is highly reliant on mineral resources, especially iron ore. So, that celebration, one has to think a lot more carefully about that. You have celebrations of reduced poverty rates, but you find that those reductions are very focused, don't really take into account the rural sector where you have increasing poverty rates. And a very, very important factor there is a situation where you have, a youth demographic that has almost been sidelined by all that's been going on in Sierra Leone. You have unemployment rates that are still at 60%. And again, when you think of the particularity of this country and the particularity of this demographic, you find that, this can be seen as quite a dangerous situation to be in. And part of the reasoning for that is that the Sierra Leonean government itself has very little control over, or probably does have control over the policies it should be carrying out. But, the involvement of the IFIs, as I mentioned earlier, limits the extent to which it can exercise some more control over the policies that it should decide upon. So you have a discussion around education that's focusing on the education of children, which is very important. But if you have a particular situation like Sierra Leone, you have to be thinking about more of that. You have to be thinking of the context and the importance of thinking about education for young people as well, because of the role that this demographic has played in the conflict that has occurred there. Another example, you think about Afghanistan, and again, prioritizing private sector engagement has also meant that you have the flourishing of an illicit private sector in terms of the production of opium. So this is not to label some of these policies as problematic in and of themselves, but to say that we have to think of this very carefully against the background of the context that we're dealing with here. And unfortunately, the liberal peace thesis doesn't allow for that, doesn't give any space for that. So if we say, so that I'm not just criticizing and not putting anything forward, what I want to suggest is that there are a lot of other experiences we can learn from. I think we can learn very much, especially from the global south, from parts of Asia. I think we can learn also from the past. And I'd like to speak to a few spaces where that is possible. We've spoken about, the title of this session is Developmental Post-Conflict Reconstruction. I dare say quite a few of us here are aware of the developmental state paradigm. And if you like, this paradigm comes out of experiences of developmental states in East Asia. Now, quite often we talk about their rapid growth, the rapid growth of these economies, their very successful economic transformation, especially based on very strong industrialization processes. What has not really been reflected upon is also the role that conflict has played in some of these situations. When we think of a country like South Korea, for instance, one can reflect upon the fact that, in fact, it's post-war recovery, so that's it's civil war in the Korean Civil War in the 1950s. Part of that post-war recovery process was actually anchored around the building of a strong and very centralized state. Now, of course, this was anchored by the military. So I'm not advocating a return to military rule, but I'm saying that we need to reflect a bit more on those experiences to see what lessons we may draw upon or not. But just to reflect on those experiences, to give ourselves a wider range of situations to try to learn from. And there you see a situation where you had, the building of this very strong, very centralized state that was able to drive a very strong industrialization agenda, a long-term agenda, moving away from this short-term project-like approach to thinking about its own post-conflict reconstruction process. Being able to target particular sectors, particular industrial sectors, target particular firms. You needed a particular kind of state to be able to manage such a process, to be able to build on a legacy of colonial investments that benefited from the Japanese colonial government, to be able to invest in particular types of physical infrastructure, to be able to invest in education in a way that was thinking about its own long-term industrialization agenda. I think also we can think about Taiwan, a bit of a different situation in terms of its own political tensions, but very real political tensions nonetheless. The post-1949 Taiwanese national government's relationship with mainland China meant that, that government saw itself as, always having to, keep an eye on what was going on mainland China. And really treating industrialization as a survival mechanism. And that meant that you had a state that was thinking about the long term, had to think about the long term, because it had, what one may consider an aggressor right on its doorstep. But, we see that, if you like, what could be seen as a fear, a security challenge, actually being utilized to drive its own development agenda. And there also you see another pattern of industrial development that was drawing from a small-scale agricultural base successfully to put in place a very, very strong manufacturing sector. And then we can think about Japan as well. If you like, the exemplar in terms of thinking about developmental states. And there you see, many times when one discusses the role of the developmental states in driving industrial development especially, Japan's bureaucracy has played a very, very central role in that. And in fact, it is the reality of Japan's security situation, its challenges with the Sino-Japanese War, the Pacific Wars, that led to the building of this very, very strong bureaucracy, also world famous. In fact, many have argued that the bureaucracies one sees in South Korea and in Taiwan were actually exports from Japan during its colonization of these countries. And so what I'm really trying to do there is not to say everyone needs to be experiencing conflict to think about development, but to say that conflict in and of itself need not be a reason to stop thinking about development in a long-term and a sustainable manner, and especially about structural transformation and industrial development. So, of course, it's interesting. Oh, and another case, I think, that brings us home as well. I want to reflect on Nigeria. Not Nigeria today, Nigeria in the immediate post-independence, post-colonial period, thinking about Nigeria after the Biafran War. You know, this is something that has been reflected upon as well. And I think it's important to draw our minds back to this. I think it's also important to posit an example from the African continent around this. Nigeria, if you like, some have argued that Nigeria was energized in the period following, the Nigerian state that is, was energized in the period following the Civil War. And as part of this, was able to inject, if you like, more verve into its development planning process. Here, there was a sense of trying to reunify the country, and trying to reunify the country on the basis of a new economic transformation agenda, trying to argue for a move from a reliance on petroleum resources to industrialization. Now, one can argue about the way that it went about this and how sustainable that was. But the fact is that it was very clear that in the post-conflict period, you know, there was much that could be done, and much was actually carried out. Indigenization and nationalization policies to allow the state control of financial resources to actually drive that industrial agenda were very, very important policies in this period. I think also the kind of physical and social infrastructure that was put in place were very important. Many can think about the sort of investments in education that were really centered around addressing security challenges, investments in National Youth Service Corps, investments in federal unity schools. These were targeted at particular developmental ends. Now, it's interesting to reflect on this. Of course, this was a different time, in some cases a different space. What does this mean for today? Now, what I want to say means for today is that there is a lot we can take from this. Some have argued that now the conflicts that happened in these spaces, how they ended speaks a lot about what the state might be able to go on to do. For many of these cases, I've spoken about conflicts for which there was an external aggressor, and that affects the, if you like, capacity and resilience of the state to be able to carry out some of these development agendas. The argument has been put forward that in a case where you have civil conflict, internal conflict, and you have a state that is not, does not have the capacity or resilience to be able to carry out what are, you know, quite robust policy frameworks, you can have an international agency in place, like what you had in East Timor. And this is good because you have an autonomous institution that is able to work independently. But I would argue that you never have an autonomous institution in that way. All these institutions have an ideological base. When it appears as though the institution is autonomous, really it means that they're working to the mainstream ideology. And I think that was reflected upon when Professor Lukoshi spoke about the way the UN carried out its activities in East Timor. So what is the alternative, especially when we're talking about Africa? I think we can be talking about regionalization in a particular way. Talking about the role that regional organizations can play in driving a developmental agenda around post-conflict reconstruction, challenging this liberal peace thesis and neoliberal and liberal peace building. In many cases, really, the reality is that you have states on the ground that will not be able to carry out the sort of policies that I have alluded to. Now, of course, I don't think this is I think there's some precedence about the role that regionalization can play in driving structural transformation and industrial development and sustainable development. When you think about Asia, for instance, you know, Asia is considered the most successful developing region in the world, and a lot of that centers around the level of industrial development that you see there. And a lot of that has come out of the regional frameworks that are in place. Not the formal ones, but the roles that the major Asian economies have played in the rest of Asia. The role that Japan has played in the rest of Asia, the role that China has played in the rest of Asia, and the role that South Korea has played in other parts of Asia. I mean, this is a region in the world where you have the highest levels of intra-regional trade, and it's very clear the impact that has had on development. So for me, I think regionalization will be the very big answer for our continent. I think, of course, there's much to be done to see that work out in reality. I think the way we think about economic development, the way the AU has done and the way ECOWAS has done is not quite there yet. I mean, I think there's been a lot of criticism about NEPAD, and the way NEPAD has unfortunately not challenged dominant thinking about development from a neoliberal basis. In fact, some people will argue that it's actually reinforced that neoliberal thinking. So we have to be thinking about, African institutions that are challenging that. I think with ECOWAS as well, there have been some challenges because you see ECOWAS carrying through a poverty reduction strategy paper for the region, much on the same basis that you see at the national level, and that is very, very problematic. But I think there's still hope because you also see an ECOWAS that very recently rejected the economic partnership agreements. So there is space. And also the point that has been made now, that the state is not quite as vilified as it's made out to be. Even the developed world has realized this in the present day of crisis and has, unwittingly gone around the advice they have been offering to the developing world. And I think this could be an entry point to addressing this and thinking about developmental post-conflict reconstruction, where the state, in post-conflict environments where the state does not have the capacity to drive through what are very, very important and robust development policies. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My fellow panelists, good afternoon. First, I'd like to thank the first two speakers because they've made my work a bit easy. Because the first speaker then has mapped out post-conflict reconstruction and the paradigms of neoliberalism and what some of the challenges are in that paradigm. And the second speaker has also taken us through the idea of a developmental state and some of the examples that we have that we can look at. So I will not add anything to those two streams of thoughts. I would like now to take you on a different target. One of the leading Kenyan African authority on African thought was produced by this university. He was called, he's the late Professor Osaga Odak. I don't know how many of you know of Professor Osaga Odak's work. But Professor Osaga Odak's work, together with the other African thinkers, Ngugi, Mamdani, and others, have talked about that one of the justifications for colonialism was always that we did not have a state. No African country or African people or peoples had any state. They did not have any sense of organized political thought or institutions or economic institutions, for that matter, organized and centralized, and that they had authority with legislative, executive, judicial capacities. So that was one of the justifications for colonialism. There are many others. And where they came to Africa and found structures like those, many of them were said to be foreign. They could not think that they could be indigenous. So they were said to be foreign. The Great Zimbabwe, for example, is being attributed to Phoenicians. The Swahili city-states Arab Asiatic. The Egyptian, some have even gone far and said they're alien. Huh? Must be some alien visitation. I mean, they couldn't be that advanced. Huh? So, first, no African state had structures that can be defined as a state. Two, that if they were, they could not be indigenous or local. They must be foreign. And then thirdly, they said that the explanations of why there's so much conflict in Africa is that colonialism left too soon. Right? Said they should have stayed longer and finished the job. Huh? So some of us consider these new ideas as a way of that extension that they are about, they need to finish the job. Huh? But I would like to also speak about our experiences here in Kenya and say that one way of approaching developmental conflict, post-conflict reconstruction, is to say that you need to have a participatory approach to build consensus within citizens to agree on a new transformative constitution and policy framework. Right? That is essential in the sense that you will then be not only talking to citizens and say, where did we go wrong? And what are some of the issues that are important to you? But you'll also be using that as a way of deconstructing the past. Okay? And it is important to consider that some of the constitutional and policy choices that you make in constitution making are critical in preventing conflict and making sure that societies then become at peace with themselves and are involved in development. So I will give you a few examples of what we try to do with the Kenyan Constitution. And it's not very unique Kenyan because we borrowed a great deal from the South African experience as well as the Ghanaian experience in thinking through and some aspect of the Ugandan experience and Rwandese experience in terms of thinking of how do you deconstruct the past and construct a future by reinventing state organs and structures. Huh? So in the past we had a choice, for instance, to say that we are limited to 3 arms of government. Huh? So you have the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary as the driving force, and you have the market forces that ideally the legislature leaves the market forces alone a little bit, and when you want to interfere too much, the judiciary then comes and protects the markets. Huh? So we had choices. So the first one was to say, who is sovereign? That was the first fundamental question that was facing Kenyans. Who is sovereign? Is it the executive that is sovereign? Is it parliaments? Because you've had these debates all over the world and Africa, to be specific. In Kenya, we had a big debate, always because we were using a very strange form of presidential system that was mixed with some parliamentary aspects. The presidency was always claiming that they are sovereign. Okay? And I'll come back to this point because some of you are thinking, when you say sovereign, you don't mean like chosen by God to be king. Huh? It exactly means that. In Kenyan context, it exactly meant that. Huh? The president was like a king, even more than a king. And then Parliament was also claiming to be sovereign. So, they say sovereignty of Parliament. I don't know what that meant, really. But the executive will say they are sovereign. Parliament will say they are sovereign. So who is sovereign? So the first thing that we try to do with the Kenyan Constitution is Article 1 of our Constitution, which is to say the people are sovereign. The people are sovereign, and people can exercise their sovereignty directly. So that's how we start. You exercise your sovereignty directly or through your democratic democratically elected representatives. So that's how we deconstructed. Huh? So directly, and there are many examples in our constitution. Under the former presidential system, you could not meet more than 6 people without a license. So now, for example, we say all Kenyans can meet peacefully, can demonstrate peacefully, can picket peacefully, and can exercise that sovereignty in many other different ways. Some people call it mass action. But that's what we meant. It's the only way we got rid of an oppressive and just system was to say the people are sovereign, and we use mass action to remove an unjust system. And we said we will constitutionalize that. That was become our first constitutional principle. But also, we know that many African countries tried to say, you know, in order to have an impact on this question of a developmental state, let us establish a chapter called Directive Principles of State Policy. And if you look at those earlier 60s, the constitutions in the 60s and in the 70s, the chapter called Directive Principles of State Policy were where the social rights were, the economic rights were, right? Where citizens' participation in the economy, the principles are located there. And we were worried for 2 reasons that we didn't go that route. We didn't go the route of saying, establish this principle of Directive Principle State Policy, Chapter 1, or Chapter 2, or Chapter 3. Our analysis was that in all places where there was a chapter called Directive Principles of State Policy, the judiciary every time said that that chapter is not justiciable. In other words, you cannot go to court and enforce that chapter. Right? So why would you have social rights but you can't enforce them? Why do you have economic rights but you can't enforce them? So what we decided to do was to say, okay, you can't go that route. The second problem of having one chapter or one distinct place where you locate those ideas was that people would see it as a separate, distinct chapter. So what we decided to do was to mainstream it in every chapter. These ideas of people's rights, a rights-based approach which locates both rights and responsibilities of citizens, you mainstream them throughout. So, for example, rights on, for example, housing, you put it in the chapter of the Bill of Rights, rather than it being in a directive, a separate directive principle state policy. But we also did other things. We said, okay, introduce a fourth sphere of influence that is outside the classical 3 arms government. And these are the independent officers and constitutional officers, independent commissions and the constitutional officers that are in the Kenyan Constitution. Okay? Now, I don't want to spend too much time on the Kenyan Constitution. I just want to go now in terms of what are the challenges of changing this paradigm that exists and the challenges that have been established by those eloquent speakers who spoke before me. One, when you say you are going to deconstruct, deconstruction is a simple word, but a complex, very, very complex idea. Right? Because you have to deal first with mindset. You have to deal with mindset, and you have that mindset. I'll go back to Professor Saga Odak. Professor Saga Odak talks about memory. And I'm glad my sister talked about some things that within us that were working, structures that were there, they were working, right? So these new terminologies and say, no, a stimulus packet in the United States of America by the Barack Obama administration to say, oh, invest in more roads, invest in more schools, invest in more teachers, but you can't do that in Africa. Huh? Reduce public spending. In Africa, reduce public spending. So for me, it is connected to memory, because you have to remember. But also memory connects to something even more profound, which is imagination. Right? So when you talk about, say, are there different ways we can think? You can only get to that place of different ways of thinking if we can imagine differently. Right? So how a state imagines becomes critical. Who are you? How do you relate to each other? This deconstruction also means coming to terms with certain fault lines that has existed for a long time. You know, when people talk about Professor Fumi and others who have been working on security sector reform, I always say we needed security sector reform at independence. Right? You know why we needed it at independence? Because at independence, the security apparatus of the state was constructed to protect the colonial force. And they were given the mandate to promote and protect that. Now, here you come, independence. Same fellows, same structures, same command and control structures, right? Only masters have changed. But your relationship with those masters, you're saying, you know, that way you're going, it's very difficult. The way you deal with Africans is this way. This is the security sector briefs you get. Huh? You come in first day in State House. Huh? At that time it was called in Kenya Government House. They give you briefings. Huh? And he says this is ordinary for all prime ministers and presidents. Huh? You are given a security brief. And the security brief tells you what they have been doing for 100 years to protect colonial force. Where the local population is seen as the enemy. Right? Local production is seen as enemy. You know, local production to us, what was local production to us? Local production to us was what we could do ourselves and what we could undermine in the economy of the colonial government. Huh? Economic saboteuring was part and parcel of struggle for independence. Right? So we deconstructed others, but we did not deconstruct economic saboteuring. We didn't tell our people, okay, now this is our government. Huh? What we were doing to stop the economic activities of the colonial forces. Stop it at any waste. You're not wasting, you are giving back to the people. Huh? When you take from the government, you're giving back to the people. But at independence, we needed to deconstruct and de-roll and tell people, now, this is our government. Mali ya umma ni mali yako. Si mali ya colonial force anymore. So, I don't want to go for long about this. I want to make only 3 points and then sit down. One is the continuation of what my sister started. You were told that I am from the East African community. And I truly believe, for me, that one way of how you do things differently is this integration process. I'm not saying we don't have challenges. We do have challenges. For example, deconstructing the old notion of sovereignty to mean little drawings on the table by some foreigners sitting in a foreign capital and say, okay, you have influence here, you have influence there. Since you lost the war, you give part 3/4, only remain with 1/4, right? Right? And then they, at those days it was postcarding. Huh? They sent by ship a postcard. 3 months later you realize we are no longer Italian. We are now French. Or we are no longer German. Huh? It's because the Italian lost, the Germans lost. We are no longer German. We are now British. So we are trying to deconstruct that, and it is amazing. You'll be absolutely shocked how some of very senior people have embraced and are clinging to those old maps that were created and the idea of sovereignty. So we are bringing down boundaries. Borders are no longer going to be barriers for us. borders are going to be bridges for us. You can't tell a Maasai in Kenya, people always joke, and a Maasai in Tanzania, who are first cousins, that you can't go with your goats that side. Right? People always talk a joke about the Uganda border and Kenya. And they said, one night, this guy woke up, and his sitting room was in Kenya, the rest of the house was in Uganda. It's a joke, but it signifies something. So we are trying to do that. We are also trying to relook at some of the things that some of the thinkers of earlier days talked about. Mwalimu Nyerere talked about kujitegemea, right? Self-reliance. We are saying not only kujitegemea, but add kutegemeana. So self-reliance, but also depending on each other. I could start quoting statistics on how much trade has grown between the 5 partner states and also the neighboring countries. But I don't think we have the time for that. Secondly, it is important for us to also talk about not only deconstructing, but construction. Constructions of new realities. One of the biggest challenges that we're facing in Kenya today is how do we implement a transformative constitution? What is the difference between a transformative constitution and constitutions in the old way of making? The transformative constitution, one of its hallmarks is that it takes a deliberate decision to depart from the past radically. To reject the past and to embrace a new future that is based on values and principles. So key to transformative constitutions and policy making is values and principles. If you see any constitution or policy that is thrust to us as Africans, the first thing you should ask, be stupid, like me, the first thing you should ask is, where are the values in this policy? You should ask always, values, where are the values in this policy? Where are the principles in this policy? Because that's what we are looking at for now and saying. Because if you don't ask that, you come back to structural adjustment programs. And when you ask why, they say, oh, because very smart people with many degrees have thought about this in New York. This is Washington consensus business. So construction is important. And let me finish with the last one, which is, if you are deconstructing and constructing, then there's a gulf in between. Transition. And this is where we are stuck. Either, if you look at most of the African countries being given the strong dose of post-conflict reconstruction, right? Either they are still at deconstructing or they are in transition. We have not reached the question of construction. And transition has its special challenges. I'll only mention 2 today, right? The first one is that transition has a challenge of those who are heavily invested in the status quo. Be they foreign agents, foreign players, or local ones. But let me put it a different way. Those who have benefited from the chaotic past, those who are still continue to benefit from the chaotic Africa, right? Those who have continued to benefit from corruption. They said that we made our money through corruption, now you want to remove us. We don't know any other way. Retire. All right? And connected to this is the question of odious debt. We can't talk about international politics without talking about odious debt. Those states in the world which gave either collapsed governments or corrupt regimes loans on behalf of the people, knowing very well that that money is not going for any project or program for the people. Right? So one of them is that it has its, as Kenyans we say it this way, it has its owners. There are people who own the past and they want to retain the past at any cost. They will not give up. And one of the fundamental, if you want to look at the test for African countries, is land. If you don't see any movement in transformation on land, then you know we are not making progress. The last challenge that we have is the one which I've already mentioned, which of imagination. If we don't invest enough on imagination as a state, as a region, I come from the East African community. I come from a community where Rwanda had to emerge from everywhere they could see. Those who were put there to make policy. Everywhere they could see was dead bodies and injured people. They had to start thinking, how do you first of all bury or dispose of about 500,000 to 800,000 bodies? From such to reconstruction. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Zane. Thank you very much, the three panelists. I think as I listen to you, I think of development, the stem of the word, the very word that we are dealing with, which is development. I think it is very complex. And Adebayo did reflect on the framing of the issues and this moving bullet of challenges and issues, and us really almost not knowing where the problem is in terms of addressing the issues at stake. But my question has always been, and hopefully we'll answer these questions as we go along by the panelists and the plenary, who has the responsibility to respond, and how do you pick this response, in particular when you take it into consideration that the initial phase of reconstruction, the local is really not in charge to a large extent. I had a bit of experience in Liberia in the earlier part of it when I could literally see the locals beat up policemen and respect the Canadian security details. And the local staff that were being nurtured to take over could easily be slapped around by anybody. So my question is, at what point, whether they are the five phases that we normally talk about, at what point do you have the state or the local starting to put its its position in place so that this can continue on? And again, this issue of Africa being an experiment, it's true that Africa is an experiment, but the critical question about this experiment is our role as locals. Whether we are the leaders or whoever, the local team that is in the process, do we have a role at that point of reconstruction? Or at what point do we have a role? Do we have a role at the end of it, after the reconstruction is done, or at the beginning? This is not my area, but I'm framing it around development, and hopefully I'll get some answers, because at the end of the day, really, what one needs to be dealing with is very practical in terms of the issues that face us. Eka, you did mention about, I like your point that there is no autonomous institution. And that this is good for us because everybody else thinks that, oh, we've created an autonomous institution. Kenya now has an electoral body that is autonomous, independent, so things will work. She's told us there is no autonomous institution. If at all, is only conventional. That is going by the norm, the ideology that is prevailing. Very important. But you again talk about regionalism and appreciate it. But my question to my brother here, how do you get this regionalism in place when the local doesn't work? Especially land that you told me. I've always been concerned as somebody coming from my background that we want to emphasize regionalism, but the local, the state, the country does not work. So how do you pull to get individuals to get to the East African Legislative Assembly and have those values that you are talking about that can really move us ahead when at the local level it does not work? So I like your issue of stateless. When I was a student of history and eventually a student of political science, before I could be able to analyze, I was taught that there were stateless societies. But eventually, as I went ahead, I realized now when I was a teacher teaching students that there is no stateless society. These were just myths. And yet in the teaching and training, people are being taught, I was taught, that they were stateless societies. And I could write it, and I guess I must have written an essay about a stateless society. But I came to know too late that there are no stateless societies. So again, we are talking about our training background, and we are talking about, I think Africa sometimes gets to a situation where we undermine ourselves. Africa undermines itself in terms of its policies, in terms of its training programs, and how do you get out of this cul-de-sac? Let me just open it up because it's not my podium, but I'm just raising some of the concerns that I struggle with as somebody who is also interested in this issue. And we all know that security and society is for all of us. It's the only topic that draws everybody, especially when you come to communities, even cities. If you look at entities that are strong and have a good binding, good values together, they began by addressing security. So it's a topic that is of interest to literally all of us. So let's get some responses, and we will get a number, engage them so that they don't forget. You saw them present without any notes. So we will have a few, and then they engage, and then we have another lot and another lot until when, Godwin Murunga, you're here, until when you say we stop. So who is going first to raise some of the issues or to ask questions or add to the issues? Yes, over there. The second one, I want to get, you will be second, third, Nasongo, my colleague, Dr. Nasongo, and you're fourth. Let's go that way. Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Mabito. My name is Wali Ismail. I currently work for International Life, but I am 100% ALC. Thanks to the panelists for provoking the issues, for putting very important issues on the plate. I will first declare that I am not a development person. Perhaps I'm a developmental person. I come from the other side of the divide, and you see the side where I'm seated. All of us on this side, we are people in the business of peace and security. So, my starting point, 3 key observations in terms of taking post-conflict reconstruction as a starting point rather than development. Apologies to the panelists. The first point is this. When we talk about post-conflict reconstruction, we need to ask ourselves, what is the purpose? Is it to enable stability or to promote social change in Africa? From my own understanding, post-conflict reconstruction in Africa, as we know it today, has nothing to do with change. It is all structured around promoting stability. By stability, I mean for a state to have a semblance of state, to have a president or certain state institutions that externals or internationals can relate to. Wherever you go, the UN intervention, peacekeeping intervention, the first thing is we have to put a government in place. And we have to get the central bank and all other economic institutions working. So, post-conflict construction, the way it is designed, the way it is structured, does not promote change, it promotes stability. How does it promote stability? The 3 key anchors of contemporary post-conflict construction, there are 3. Political reform, economic reform, security sector reform. I can't go into each of these, but the logic behind the reform initiatives defined in each of these 3 areas, they are logic of stability rather than logic of change. That's the first point. The second key observation in relation to post-conflict reconstruction in Africa is that African institutions, most especially African leaders or people in policy institutions, in government policy institutions in Africa, appear to have surrendered intellectually when it comes to post-conflict construction in Africa. If you take, even in the academia, if you take a brief survey of the amount of research, publications on issues around causes of war, peacekeeping, peace operations, versus publications on post-conflict construction, you will see where the emphasis lies. Similarly, you go to the African Union, there is only two people in a department for post-conflict construction. And you go to the PSOD, where you have Peace Support Operations Department, and you see several dozens or hundreds of people. And you also look at the policy template that African institutions, the AU and ECOWAS, that I'm quite conversant with. You look at the amount of policy template they have on issues around peace building, peace operations, versus post-conflict construction. You will see where the emphasis lies. There is only one single policy framework, and it's just one page, called Principles of Post-Conflict Construction by the African Union. ECOWAS has nothing on post-conflict construction. So that again suggests that there is intellectual surrender when it comes to thinking around issues around post-conflict construction, and which in a way justifies this initiative. The third key observation is that it seems there is an assumption that issues of post-conflict construction is new in Africa, or something we are just grappling with. And I think Eka mentioned in certain instances that this is not new. We have abundance of instances or cases in Africa where post-conflict construction has taken place. But the key point out of that I wanted to make is that we seem to have neglected how African societies have achieved social change or went through social transformation in history, even before colonial times and even after colonial times. The emphasis is often on the state rather than society. And I think if we as developmental post-conflict reconstruction is going to take place in Africa, the answer will probably lie in society rather than the state. In the light of this, I would like to put 3 or 4 more dilemmas on the table in terms of the emerging scenario of post-conflict reconstruction in Africa. Of course, we have the orthodox Western paradigm built around neoliberal reforms, neoliberal norms, neoliberal agenda. But now, there seems to be an undergrowth of that, which is what you find in Rwanda, Ethiopia, and increasingly in Kenya, which is the government of those countries sounding like Chinese. You have the Chinese model of state building beginning to take shape. And what does this model raise? If you put this model and the orthodox Western model side by side, there are some interesting dilemmas and puzzles. The first one is development, however we define it. Can we have development side by side with civil liberties? Example, Rwanda. Can we have development side by side with social justice? Can we have development side by side with democratization and good governance as defined in Western norm? And finally, is development signposted by infrastructural development congruent with development signposted by human development? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. I am Clement Mazrui from the Institute of Diplomacy and International Studies. I don't know whether I'll be philosophical or poetic, but to begin with, Professor Olukoshi, is developmental post-conflict reconstruction necessarily infrastructural? or that which is revolving around economy and money-mindedness, rather than that of stability. Hence, if it can involve issues that are of stability, that imagination, Honorable Abubakar, would mean bringing out the sociological paradigm that will encompass the local, as brought out by Professor Mitula, in the sense of family values that will bring in cohesiveness and unity to bring that stability, and not necessarily the economic emancipation as such. Madam Eka, if I'm not wrong, you seem relaxed to have come up with a solution on regionalism. But did you think of regionalism without a link on international organizations' funding? Honorable Abubakar may be able to tell us. Are regional bodies in Africa not funded, technically aided by the same international organizations with ideologies that have some conditionalities on that post-conflict reconstruction? Thank you.
Wow. There was somebody there.
Both philosophical and poetic.
Yeah, thank you very much. My one quick question for each of the panelists. My name is Nasomo. Brother Bayo, I enjoyed your presentation very well. And it raised some curiosity on my part about our fellow African brothers and sisters who work for the same international organizations that have these kinds of deleterious ideologies. Now, my question is this. To what extent do you, working for these organizations and others working for them, to what extent are you able to impact their policy for the better of Africa? With regard to ECA, you raised the question of the developmental state. Of course, it's hinged on the experiences of East Asia, countries like Japan, countries like South Korea, countries like Taiwan, countries like Singapore. But if you look at the societies of those countries, you find that they are essentially homogeneous. And so when you create a powerful state, the state is serving its own people. You transpose that to Africa. All African countries are heterogeneous, where the political class operates on the basis of politicized ethnicity or ethnicized politics, the politics of exclusion. Can that model actually work in Africa? A comment from you on that would be good for me. And finally, Honorable Abubakar, at what stage are we now in the process of integrating the East African economies? What are the major challenges that face the process? Have we learned anything from the collapse of the East African community in 1978? What lessons have been learned? What have not been learned? Thank you.
My question goes specifically to Professor Olakushi. From his presentation, I had the feeling he's against conditionalities, which appears to be the position of a good number of people in the room. What I can say is that personally I have no problem with conditionalities because when you have conditions, usually they are never really conditions that can actually suffocate a country. One example, for instance, is universal primary education. I don't see how that as a condition can actually disturb a country that wants development. Now, would you say, following from this, that you can consider conditions as the main constraint to post-conflict reconstruction in Africa?
Thank you. I think let's get the panelists rolling on this fast.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And, thank you for the various observations. One thing which we have, I think, not not brought to the table. The fact that we function in an international system which is defined by relations of power. And if we conduct our conversations or even our thought processes as though asymmetries of power did not matter at different levels, I think then probably we'll find it hard to reach a meeting point in terms of how we unpack some of the issues which we need to address and which some of the questions have broached upon. I think to take a global approach to the various points which you raised, Wale, I think very cogent observations which you made. Precisely the arguments you give, in my view, are the arguments which partly justify why the wall of China between post-conflict reconstruction and development thinking must be brought down, precisely for those arguments. Because essentially, all of what has been used to justify the particular model of post-conflict reconstruction that dominates on the continent today, and they are not innocent, they are not neutral, they are not accidental, in my view. Those three pillars you refer to speak to a particular pattern, and you cannot really begin to meaningfully talk about underpinning them with a clear developmental anchorage without precisely the critique implicit in your observation being brought to the fore. And you are right. I think Eka also alluded to it, that we have, in fact, even within living memory on our continent, examples of how post-conflict reconstruction was done differently within living memory. I mean, it was the second national development plan in Nigeria. Yeah, and the whole ideology, the slogan of the 3 Ds. Remember that the reconstruction part of it was also the period when some of the boldest development initiatives of post-colonial Nigeria were launched. In fact, to the shame of the Nigerian elite, what it has done since then has been to milk those projects to the point where now they collapse on the elite itself, right? So you build an airport, you build roads, you build a north-south thing, a whole project of states, post-conflict state reconstruction took place. And I think it's important for us to bridge that gap. So it's a tweaking of what you said, really, that I think will be my response. To say, I agree with you on the critique and on the limits of those 3 pillars. And precisely the point which I hope we can agree upon is how do we incubate all of these within a developmental agenda that actually takes a long-term view of structural transformation and change in our country's economy and society as the linchpin around which you construct post-conflict reconstruction policies. Precisely because it's not neutral. I mean, the conversations, and you are right, I would not say that we surrender the terrain. I was in Codesria, many of us were in Codesria here. We fought battles. We fought battles against structural adjustment. And I think we can claim to have played an important role in delegitimating structural adjustment. I listened to Stiglitz as vice president of the World Bank, fortunately, accidentally, but listened to him on 3 occasions where he elaborated his post-Washington consensus, beginning from DC, moving on to Geneva, and then going on to Helsinki. And each time I said to him that if it was not for the fact that what he was saying resonated with many of us who are critics of adjustment, whether as Africans or as professional economists, and if it was not for the fact that much of what we wrote and which was dismissed found somehow by some osmotic roots, found their way into what he was elaborating upon in his 3 essays on the post-Washington consensus. I could have accused him of plagiarism. Because as far back as an undergraduate at Ahmadu Bello University, 1982, I was still a 3rd-year student, when the first meeting by Codesria on structural adjustment took place, and the communique that came out of it was exactly the same thing except in language, on the 10 points that came out of Stiglitz's first speech in Washington on the post-Washington consensus. So it depended on who was saying it for the world to listen at the end of the day, which is what I'm also saying about power. Then when you have a charlatan like Paul Collier, who runs around the whole place, entering into the field of post-conflict reconstruction with a particular brand of neoclassical economics, which pushes an agenda of domination. Let's be very clear about it. So we did not surrender the field. Ismail Rashid is here. They were amongst the people who took on Paul Richards, fighting for the rainforest. They did a volume of Africa development in response to Paul, to say, you don't even know the society you are talking about. And in the meantime, you purport to be. And remember that Paul Richards was patronized by the World Bank. This was the time when Paul Collier was the chief economist of the Africa division of the World Bank. And so beginning to prepare himself for his nest in Oxford, the Center for the Study of African Economies, where he has been churning out all of this rubbish that passes for policy. And then supported increasingly by the likes of Tony Blair, Africa Governance Initiative, who basically has turned that machine into a money-making venture. And you go to, in the context within which I work today, I go to Guinea-Conakry at the invitation of the president of the country. We want to train officials in the office of the president on monitoring and evaluation. My interlocutor is some little person who claims to be a Tony Blair something foundation. I said, no, I'm sorry. I didn't come here to chat with Tony Blair or his people. If I cannot chat with people who are going to be the locals you are talking about, then there's no conversation at the end of the day. So there is power in all of these things. Which ideas are given vent by who and patronized by who is a big issue. And Paul Collier has come up with all kinds of ideas that are self-serving. International Service Delivery Authority, if you read his book, about how to save the DRC from itself and its leaders. It's not so much a question of saying that let us rebuild the Congolese state. How can you ever govern the Congo without a state? And the story and tragedy of the Congo from independence has been that that state never settled down for one day. And Paul Collier's answer is that this is typical of Africa. So the only way is that we boycott this state and help the people with humanitarian thing by setting up, he proposed it in his book, an International Service Delivery Authority. My response to him was that, and you will, as usual, be the chief consultant to the service authority for a small fee, right? A small fee. And it's what it comes down to. So we can give those examples. It's not that we are not challenging them. But I think, of course, the moral in your message is that we can do much more. I hope that the modest steps we are going to be taking, I mean, there are people here who are established authorities in the domain, who, in terms of giving what I will call a much more considered and balanced perspective to issues of security sector reform, of peace building, of peace enforcement, of post-conflict management, have contributed tremendously compared to anybody that I know in the field. They are in this room. And if our efforts brought together in a conversation with the needs for structural transformation today can shift the paradigm, even for our own purposes. Because really, at the end of the day, it's what we do that matters. And I think being able also to get a critical mass of policy people. I mean, our policy officials is a perennial disease. They are happy to welcome the little kid who comes out of the Harvard thing, you know, than to welcome Winnie Mitula. You say, Winnie Mitula, what does she want? Right? She's local. It cannot be. And the structure of advice, Jay Cox made a very ironic statement as Vice President for Africa that there are more technical advisors, foreign, in Africa today than there were colonial officials. right? The colonial governor general and all of those people, we counted all the number. There are more foreign technical advisors. And it's all part of a grand machine. There is a struggle for Africa. We need to understand it. There is a struggle for the heart and soul of Africa. And that struggle has important and powerful local allies who are part of the whole machinery. So I take your point very much, but it's precisely for that we need to tweak it and begin to challenge the discourses and see what is possible. I mean, I made the comment in passing that unhappy is the country that allows itself to be overrun by the United Nations. I work in that system. Adedeji. It's the most donorized institution in the world. The United Nations is so heavily donorized that at the end of the day, you cannot even have a meaningful conversation out of the terms of reference agreed by the donor. I mean, try working with the UNDP, okay? But you know, IDEP is different, of course. That donorization. Let us grow up. There is no country in this world that was developed by the UN. The best that the UN has known has been a trusteeship mentality. It goes back to the period after the Second World War, well, even from the First World War, when the first trusteeship mandates and within the League of Nations was set up. And that mentality pervades the Department of Peacekeeping Operations of the UN, to some extent the Department of Political Affairs. I meet heads of UN missions, including most recently the Mali one, the Danish colleague who runs the Mali operations. And I told him, first thing you need to learn is that you are not a governor general of Mali. I meet the one who ran the operation in Sierra Leone, 50th anniversary of the country. And I was telling Ismail Rashid, I said, you know, the shock in it is that the guy says to me, well, listen, watch when the president is reading his 50th anniversary message. He's going to be looking at me for approval. And I say, but excuse me, I'm an African. I can't tolerate this kind of insulting behavior on your part. You may have written the speech for the president, but that doesn't give you the right to publicly come to humiliate that president by saying, yeah, sorry?
Did you actually look at it?
Well, I am sorry to say yes. You know, so at the end of the day, we also have to introspect seriously. But no country has been developed by the UN. None will be developed by the UN. At the end of the day, I said to colleagues, somebody said, what do we do, those of us who are in the inside? Well, we subvert as much as we can. If there are takers, we link up with takers. I try to do that. And to the extent possible, send the message clearly. The UN needs you more than you need it. Yeah. Make of the UN what you want of it. And just look at Kagame a bit. All his weakness is considered. And you will begin to see the glimpse of what is possible. Look at the late Meles Zenawi to some extent. Yeah. And to tell you can't just come and ride roughshod over, you know, the FAO resident representative in Ethiopia was declared persona non grata. Because basically, in the name of humanitarianism, she started making an appeal for food aid for Ethiopia. That there is a threat of famine, rain will fail. And the Ethiopian government said, no, we went beyond that paradigm a long time ago. And we find it completely insulting. You might need the money for FAO, but don't put the name of Ethiopia. And actually now we withdraw your recognition from Ethiopia. You leave. It sent a powerful message to the entire UN system. You go with whatever you want to do, and the Ethiopians bring out their plan and tell you, does it fit in? It fits in. If it does not fit in, out. It's just, they still use aid. But they took the driver's seat, like the Vietnamese did, like others did. They are not being driven by people who basically begin to learn about your country when they are posted to your country, but purport to know because they are wearing some label that is UN or World Bank or IMF or whatever. So it's up to us at the end of the day. And I think we have enough intelligent people on this continent in each of our countries to be able to make a better connection between policy and knowledge. No society has developed on the basis of borrowed external connections between policy and knowledge. It has never happened, and it will not happen with us as the first. I think there was one other specific question that was directed to me. I mean, you talked of the local winning. I think I've spoken to that at the end of the day. The conditionalities. Oh, there is condition to everything in life. But the conditionality we are talking about is not the type that then removes alternatives from you, your exercise of choice. So the colleague, you had, under the conditionality philosophy, you had a choice to be here or not to be here. But when somebody says to you that the only way I can shake your hand is if you wear a white shirt, and you say, okay, I will wear a white silk shirt, they say, no, it's actually the cotton one. You can't even wear the silk one. Then you say, okay, I wear the cotton, they say it has to be Egyptian cotton. If it's not Egyptian cotton, then there's no game. So it removes all choice, and that is what undermines even the possibility for democratic governance. Why structural adjustment was also accompanied with a regime of authoritarianism, actually effectively making the 25 to 30 years of adjustment on the continent the real and true lost decades of African development. And the World Bank recognized it. It did not apologize for it, but it did recognize that it was wrong. It made mistakes in writing. And why the new president is talking of a new philosophy and a new approach. But what they have just simply done is to move out of the macroeconomic policy framework. They've left that to the IMF, and they've moved into sectoral, on water, on electricity, on education, and all of those areas. IMF, World Bank conditionality is alive and well, localized into sectors, but which, when they add up, produce a particular direction to which society is expected to move. And I don't believe that you can transform Africa today simply on the basis of societal initiatives. I think, Ismail, we need to rethink that one. No society transforms without a state which is capable, at a minimum. Let us call it capable. Will it be democratic? There is a live debate on the continent, you know. Tandika Mkandawire wrote the article on the feasibility of democratic developmental states in Africa in the Cambridge Journal of Economics. And basically, his starting point, which I share, is that there is actually a broad democratic consciousness in every people. Every people have that consciousness. The question is the conditions under which they flower and when they come to play themselves out. In the context of Africa, we know that we have fought battles and struggles against dictatorship. Are you going to tell a Kenyan, after the experience with the Moi regime and all of that, to say to them that now go back to some authoritarianism so that you get development? It will not happen, because people have carried that experience. But they have the right also to demand democracy and development. And that combination, I think, is where we are today. How do we build democratic institutions and advance the frontiers of development on our continent? Summarized in the concept of structural transformation, which is a very old Marxian concept. Well, it's nice to see the IMF also talking about structural transformation. Be careful, though, that they are going to appropriate it as they did with governance and give it a particular meaning. But the Maputo Declaration, where Christine Lagarde met with central bank governors of the continent, was suffused with references to structural transformation. And Justin Lee, I always say, look, you need to now begin to define what you mean by structural transformation. When I mentioned infrastructure, it was really a metaphor for saying that you cannot have structural transformation without paying attention to the productive capacities of your economy, to industrial policy, to agricultural policy, and to build a trade policy that is responsive to the needs to transform the structures of production on our continent. We cannot consume Chinese goods or anybody else's goods because you are earning foreign exchange from commodities, and then begin to talk of emergence and transformation without thinking of how to add value locally to what we produce in a way to enable us both better trade amongst ourselves and in so doing to be better able to trade with the rest of the world. Africa sent out $60 billion last year in transfers, documented by central banks of the continent. It is more than whatever anybody will give us in aid, more than what we will be given in aid. We voluntarily sent it out. So we have continued the pattern of historically subsidizing the world. And guess what? Amongst the biggest sources of illicit transfers from the continent are precisely those states that are the prime sites of post-conflict reconstruction. Precisely again because the state system is hobbled, remains hobbled, and rebuilding the institutions of state is central to any project of post-conflict reconstruction and development on the continent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bayo. I know you are very passionate to this topic. Let's have Eka. We'll still have more of you later on after the day.
Okay, thanks very much. I think a lot of the questions have been answered by Professor Lukoshi.
I do want to reinforce the point about why emphasis on the state. And I think it's been said, you know, that no instance of economic transformation has taken place globally without the state playing a very central role, not in the global north or in the global south. So if we're thinking of new paradigms, let that be a conversation in that regard. I was asked a question about regionalization and the place of international funding around that. No, I think that's a very pertinent point, you know, he who pays the piper tale, if you like. And I think there we'll point to the example of ECOWAS. I think, you know, many people make the point that ECOWAS, I believe, is funded at least 70% by its membership. And that has meant that a lot of the work that ECOWAS has done, especially around peace and security, it's been able to take its own approach, it's been able to steer that ship somewhat independently with its own agenda. But in addition to that, the point that Professor Lukoshi also made is the fact that actually, even if you are recipients of aid, you can negotiate that space if you have an agenda you're pushing. And not enough of that has been done. I spoke a lot about developmental states, and Taiwan, for instance. Many of these states actually were recipients of foreign aid. South Korea and Taiwan certainly were recipients of foreign aid, and Taiwan especially utilized that aid to facilitate a small-scale agricultural system to enable it contribute robustly to an industrialization process. So there's a lot of scope for using those resources. And I think that cannot be an excuse. Around that, when we even think about the way that regionalization can work around this. And I think Professor Mitula had also mentioned this point about regionalism and how autonomous even that process is. I think that we have to have some interesting conversations about polar states. Now, you have some on the for camp and those in the for camp and those in the against camp. But I think in many cases where you have seen regionalization or regionalism work, there is a strong influence for a polar state. Now that can work, you know, that has its merits and demerits. You think about ECOWAS again, you think about the role of Nigeria. You think about SADC, you think about the role of South Africa. When we reflect on Nigeria now, one can say, now Nigeria with the challenges it's facing and the problems we see ECOWAS having faced in Mali, you know, what connections there are, what interconnections we can identify there. And there we have to think some of the things that Dr. Nanishaki, I think, is working on around leadership and the emergence, leadership emergence, leadership effectiveness, the fact that if you have a polar state that may not be playing the role it ought to play, are there others that can try and step in and fill that gap? Those are the conversations we can begin to think about and very seriously. I also want to say that even though I speak about the role that regionalization can play in post-conflict reconstruction, I definitely subscribe to the fact that you do need to build a viable state. I don't think there's any way around this. What I see the role of regionalization being is acting as a protective space, acting as a space where you challenge the liberal peace-building agenda, where you allow the building and support to these post-conflict or these conflict-affected states, because that is not a short process. It's going to take a very long period of time to get places to get these states back into a position where they're able to push, where they're able to push a long-term agenda. So someone spoke about stability vis-a-vis, thinking more about the vis-a-vis change. No, I think stability will not cut it. And I think if we're after change, actually we have to be looking and thinking about some instability, because change will not come without instability. And I mean, I think this is just a natural way of things functioning. I don't know how many people have seen the work of, it escapes me now, civil war is not a stupid thing. Many times, sorry? Exactly, Kramer, exactly, Christopher Kramer. It's difficult to live through that, but in many cases you do have to think about the structural change that comes around that and looking for a way to harness that for the long-term development agenda. Someone spoke about status quo before. You're going to be challenging status quos. That's not necessarily a stable process to go through. So I think that's one thing we have to take on board seriously. The last point I'm going to reflect on is the one on Africa as an experiment and the roles of Africans in that. I think this is a very pertinent point. I think Professor Adedeji said it very well when he spoke about the roles that Africans have themselves played with regard to the entrenchment of neoliberal economic policies and even this liberal peace-building agenda. I think that's really, really important, and I think African elites have a lot to answer for. Something that also colleagues speak about, Dr. Lanishake, especially the African middle class. There's a lot we have to answer for in terms of the way that we are willing to keep things stable vis-a-vis driving long-term change. And I think until you see a challenge there, it's going to be very difficult to push forward many of the things that we're speaking about. And then I'm even thinking about, I don't say it's a new crop, but transnational, what have been termed transnational elites. And I'm speaking especially about those colleagues that are themselves within these international finance institutions. Many times they are far worse culprits than everybody else. I'm Nigerian and I can speak forthrightly about my own finance minister. I think it's very difficult to think of other officials in the World Bank or in the IMF that wreaked as much havoc as she has in that space. And I think we need to hold ourselves to far higher standards in this regard. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Most of the answers that needs to be given have been given. But just on the question of stability, I don't know, but I know what is not stability. Stability, one, is not the absence of open violence, because some people interpret it to mean that there is some sort of, in quotes, law and order. And secondly, it is not managing and keeping at equilibrium bubbling tensions and fault lines within the society. So if we take stability to mean much more than that, then you can't say it is stability does not include change. To me, if you are thinking of long-term stability, you must invest in change. The question would be, what is your theory of change? Huh? So for me, that is critical. Secondly, the question of a hidden or informal government structure. And we've had that in Africa for a long time. When Prof is talking about and saying that these consultants who are paid and they can even brag and say, listen to your president speaking, and they'll be looking at me for approval. For me, that symbolizes the hidden or informal government that people don't want to admit exists. And until and unless we also deal with that, we will continue to say, oh, Africans, we have constitution, but we don't have constitutionalism. Because the undermining of constitutionalism, for me, is this middle bridge where you have informal government. And informal government has two natures. It has a local nature and it has a foreign nature. The foreign nature is normally symbolized by these advisors and consultants and briefs that people get. But the informal one, in Kenya, we call it a kitchen cabinet. Huh? So before the cabinet meets, there is another smaller group of people who meet to take decisions that are then passed to the cabinet to pass. Before a minister meets to make decisions, another smaller meeting is held before or after, or both. Also, net transfer of capital. So when you talk about aid, and then the excellent point that was made in terms of South Korea with foreign aid, but the so-called Marshall Plan. Marshall Plan is foreign aid. So it's a question of how do you relate with others and how do you negotiate with others? Have we taken any lessons from the collapse of the ESC? Yes, we have. People don't forget that the original ESC was established before the EU. Right? So in terms of templates and models, people have also borrowed from our models. It's not that we've just borrowed from models of others. And Prof, you're asking, are we an experiment? I don't mind if we're an experiment of our own, that it is our ideas. We are the ones who are experimenting with these ideas. But if it is experiments of others and we are not interrogating these ideas by others, it becomes problematic. Thank you.
I'm going to have only two pressing questions. Let me see hands up. Those who are keen. Two pressing. One or two.
Okay, my name is Sebastian, a research student in development from University of Nairobi. Mine will not be a question, but a comment. Before we start to blame the state there, we as Africans, are we together? Like in Kenya here, the problem now is the tribalism. Have we come together as Africans and say that this is what we want, before we just sit down and say that the states, they're doing this, they're doing this? So, to my opinion, I think we have to come together, we educate ourselves first. Because the MasterCard Foundation has just found that in Africa, in number of 20 is just one guy who makes it to the university. We here as Africans, we are the ones who are learned. What about the guys in the villages who don't understand what you're saying right here? So my point is, we as Africans, we have to discover ourselves. Solve our own problems before blaming the other guys up there. Because we'll get the trust, we'll know what we want, and when the UN will come to us, we'll not be shaken. Because we will know the direction, we'll know what we want from them. But if we will allow those guys to manipulate us, my friends, we are going to get lost. The other problem with Africans, some of us, when we get to the leadership, we try to be selfish. We try to forget the Africans that we associate ourselves with there. Instead of letting our students go to the schools which are within our countries, we let them go to the Harvard, not in this university. Why? That is the question that we have to ask ourselves. The other point that I'm trying to make, I'm referring Africa now as here in Kenya. Our leader there, we elect them to lead us. But the corruption has been the problem. If it's about fighting and fighting, we fight within ourselves. What is that problem that we can't come together, talk and say, this is what we want? Because what I see now is like, we blame guys out there. Blaming is good, but are we offering solution to our problem? If I have an agenda Will I come up with an agenda and go to the UNEP to give me the funds, or rather I'll organize my community to come up with the funds so that we can offer ourselves? To this point, I'll because of time.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'd like to register my appreciation to the panelists. I really think you've given it good depth in terms of analysis and opening up this very important area that we need to investigate as an African society. We need to take it from that perspective. There was Mike Sebalu, member of the East African Legislative Assembly. Zain is my colleague at our place of work, and we are engaged in this process. There was a question to do with the challenge or challenges of integration. I think the main challenge that we are having, and it has been alluded to by the presenters, is kind of historical, arising out of state formation and the processes that we've gone through, then getting independence and assuming this term of sovereignty. You know, the whole idea of sovereignty is the biggest single challenge that we are facing in terms of our integration. Because we've taken integration to such a level that it is ridiculous. You know, because we feel good about sovereign poverty. Even feel good about sovereign begging. Because you want to beg alone. I want to beg as Uganda. I want to beg as Kenya. I don't want us to beg together. You know, there must be sovereign begging, sovereign poverty, sovereign backwardness, and of late even sovereign corruption and all those matters. Because when you bring other people at play, you are encroaching on the sovereignty. So sovereignty is being taken to very ridiculous levels. And that is combined with national interest. You know, you go and come up with very beautiful policies. In Arusha, you agree, we need this as a region. But when officials go back to their capitals, they go back to the cocoons of sovereignty and national interest. And you find that very, very important decisions, initiatives, are undermined under the cover of sovereignty. I just want to give you an example. We all have missions. All our countries have missions in the developed world. I just want to give an example. In UK, for instance, Uganda has an embassy there, Kenya has an embassy, Rwanda, Burundi, and Tanzania. But what are the missions doing there? All those individual missions are begging missions. You find that, and they are presenting the same issues to the same people. You find that the foreign minister of Kenya is meeting with in the foreign office. Issues being presented, infrastructure, universal primary education, healthcare, water. You know, those are the issues we are presenting. That is at 8 a.m. The Kenyan High Commissioner has done his bit. At 10, the Ugandan one walks in. Same issues. At midday, the Burundian is also there. At 3, the Tanzanian one. And at 4, the Rwandese. Now, why don't you have one mission representing East Africa and putting all those issues together? You are speaking for 130 million people, other than duplicating efforts and putting the same issues on the table. And some of these missions don't even have sufficient funding to make them run appropriately. You find one mission doesn't have sufficient heating facilities, in winter they close. They're not functioning. So why don't you pull your resources together and have one solid mission that is well funded and that is bargaining for a sizable amount of population and putting the same issues which are duplicated by their excellencies, the high commissioners of sovereign states. So I really think we need to look at these issues very, very seriously. So Rather, we should have collective engagement. And when you are speaking for 130 million people, you are a serious excellency and you're putting issues. And we can put our resources together to fund that one mission, but which is strong, other than duplicating efforts and people are presenting credentials every other day. And in terms of output, you are not getting something serious. So integration is something that can be useful, but the sovereignty syndrome is really working us very negatively, because you want to be a sovereign state with an ambassador, with a high commissioner, even where you can put your hands together and engage more seriously. We don't want to do with that. So that is one issue that we are grappling with. Every other time the ministers go back, they go back to sovereignty. And that is a major problem that we are having. And when it gets to the issue of the post-conflict reconstruction, yeah, I appreciate all those initiatives. But I also want us to go back to conflict itself. We really need to dissect it, because we do have beneficiaries of conflict, and those are many. They could be local, they could be international, they could be internal, they could be external. We also have victims of the same. Now, when it gets to the post-conflict reconstruction, how do we harmonize and reconcile those two aspects of the beneficiaries and the victims, of the ones that are prescribing, who are prescribing, and the ones who are supposed to implement? I really think we need to look at that aspect, because in whose interest, is it in anyone's interest that Africa is really conflict-free? Those that really purport to be very interested? Is it in their interest if we are to be genuine? Would someone benefit from a conflict-free Congo? Like he would when Congo is the way it is? So in terms of status, who is benefiting? There could be indications that some international community members are really concerned, but that level of magnanimity is not quite, it is not real in my view. So when we are looking at it, even some of these prescriptions, let's go back, especially some of these places. You see the issues in Rwanda, genocide. The promoters of genocide are some of the people who are high priests in terms of condemning any other intervention. So there are issues really we need to get into and appreciate this subject a little more, because these prescriptions are available, but we need to go back to the genesis, the conflict situation that is scattered across the continent. In whose interest is it? Is it in the interest of those that are engaging it the way they are, or is it in our interest? Thank you very much.
I agree with me that, for the sake of Pan-Africanism, some countries like my country, Sudan, is being backed by African countries, which, has its history of human rights violations, mass murders, and genocide, like the case of the ICC indictment for our president. This is one thing. What do you think about that? Also, I like what you talked about, the Mali, well, on the other hand, in Sudan, now the UNAMID in Darfur is being, they're too confined to the government that even they don't do anything without the government approval, even for, covering up for war crimes. What do you think?
Let me start with the easier ones. I think the Honorable's intervention about sovereignties and meaningless sovereignties. The key message I take from it is the benefit which we stand to gain as a continent if we took a much more considered effort to at least institute some methods of pan-continental coordination of action. Not to say more than that, because there are people who don't want to hear things about Pan-Africanism and, not to talk of United States of Africa and the like of it, but just basic Pan-African coordination of action. And it plays out at different levels, and we see glimpses of what is possible, actually. If you take the last EU-Africa summit, for the first time, as with those summits, the Europeans already prepared a communique, which was to be issued at the end of the summit. But for the first time, Africa actually rejected the communique. And they were almost getting to a point where there was not going to be a communique at all, which would have been a scandal. And in the end, what was hammered out at least contained important African concerns, for example, around issues of migration. So you'll notice in the statement that that was one specific thematic area out of 7 where the African collective voice prevailed. You cannot criminalize African migration when you, Europe, actually scattered people all over the world, everywhere, and benefit from migration, and you take a very narrow law and order criminal justice approach to migration issues. And it prevailed. They had no option. Okay. The same thing with the summit which is coming up with Barack Obama in a couple of weeks in August. The negotiations are going on. What I've seen of it so far is that the Africans are saying, we want to see a communique that contains ABC. It's not something the Americans are prepared to swallow. They are saying, okay, let's not even have a communique. We will not have a communique at the end of it. Well, the more we begin to see, I often say that an elite that does not have a sense of history, you talked of memory, our colleague here, but a sense of history and memory, but also just a basic sense of self-respect and dignity. Honestly, you are not ready. Yeah, it means you are just not ready. And societies, elites who have been corrupt, our colleague who was talking of corruption, oh, Japan, there is corruption. But there is a certain basic sense of self-respect and dignity. You will not be humiliated again by the world. We've been humiliated enough as Africans. If we are not prepared to say we will turn the table, and at least, even as we say in Nigeria, na poor, but I no crazy. I can be as poor as anything, as a church rat, but don't mistake my poverty for madness. We need to just get certain things together, and it begins to give you a basis to then engage on terms which are defined by you. So it pains quite a lot. It pains quite a lot. I mean, chatting with Adedeji and other colleagues this morning, we give examples of how you just see the way in which sometimes we self-humiliate. I mean, 54 people go and queue before a podium. You go for a summit with China. You are not asking for the structure of the meeting in advance. And you get to the great hall of the people, and Hu Jintao stands on an elevated podium, and they line all of you up for a handshake. That's your summit. You flew all the way there for a handshake. Or you go to TICAD. The Japanese Prime Minister is discussing with his African counterparts officially. He takes 45 minutes to say why Japan likes Africa and loves Africa. And then the rest of you 3 minutes. And whilst you're on the podium, it's not like how you've been very generous today. If your 3 minutes finishes, the technology cuts you off. You'll be talking to yourself. Nobody else in the hall will hear anything you are saying. I've seen Museveni being completely destabilized. He was still making his jokes, and 3 minutes finished, and it was finished. And they came immediately. Those hostesses invaded the podium already and were ushering in, and he was protesting. I've not started. and they said it's finished, and they were shoving in the next president to speak. Did it have to be like that? And, you sit as an African in the audience watching this kind of thing, and you say to yourself, honestly, did you even have to go to Japan? Because it's the choices we need to make, and so there is a lot of self-introspection. And I think when we talk about the meeting point between the organic relationship that must exist between knowledge and policy, this is part of it. Part of our own responsibility as scholars and intellectuals is also to begin to pose these questions more directly. Because for too long, leadership in Africa has comprised seeking to please the outside world and not so much to please Africa at home. A backpacker can walk into many African countries with little more than taxi money in their pocket, coming from anywhere else except Africa. But in Africa, even with a visa, they still ask you, what are you looking for here? And we are saying integration. What are you looking for? What did you come to do this time? I will not name the countries, just so that I can get a visa next time. And our colleague on the Sudan, it's a very difficult country. It's a very difficult situation. The violations are massive. The discontents are palpable. And I hope that the mushrooming forces of resistance in Sudan will be able to take that country beyond the current impasse, because it's really become an impasse. Al-Bashir doesn't know whether to go left or right anymore. That's really the reality of the situation. Quite apart from ICC issues, the internal contradictions within the regime itself have reached a point, and the brutal suppression of the last round of public demonstrations against the students and else, indicates to you that this is a regime that is really at the end of the road in terms of what it could do for the country. And hoping for a more secular and hopefully democratic outcome that can enable citizenship to be restored to the centerpiece of policy making and politics in that country is really the best one can hope for. Don't expect the UN in Darfur to lead that process. Don't expect. Chambers is a good man, but that's where it goes. It does as far as it can go. He will try, but really the structure of the system is such that he can only go so far. I know that he has his pains and frustrations already about the Darfur situation and an inability to move. He's been caught between the rock and the hard place. Between New York and Khartoum, the margin for maneuver is fairly limited. Bon courage, and thank you also again for the opportunity.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Very briefly, I think I forgot to respond to a question that was posed directly to me about the homogeneity of many Asian countries vis-a-vis the heterogeneity of many African countries. But I think this is an immense exaggeration. I think already I referenced the fact that, the Asian countries I was speaking about had themselves endured conflict in that, you're talking about Taiwan and mainland China, talking about, the Korean Civil War. So I don't think, I think when we think of Africa, we can't keep falling back to this argument about ethnic violence and how this is the cause of all our ills and how there's no way we can move forward. I think to flog a dead horse, the point is often made about Somalia. So it's, I don't think that's quite the point. I think the issue is the instrumentalization of difference that goes on at the level of political elite and how that is exploited. I mean, I think there are ample examples in recent times here in Kenya around that. I don't think it's just down to ethnicity. I think, across Africa as well, many very, very ethnically diverse countries have thrived. And where there's been conflict, it's not been entirely down to ethnicity, but the way in which that that has been utilized to alternative ends. But I think it's especially about, contestations contestations for power among elites in many cases, and also about economic and material conditions. This has a huge role to play around that, because somehow you're able to stir up these ideas of difference among those that
you know, have material means that mean that they have very little options to do otherwise. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Just 2 or 3 little things. One, when people talk about integration in Africa, I don't know about ECO as much, but I can tell you about the East African community and Kenya's experience. Kenya's experience has been that, for example, when our National Assembly elects people to go to the East African Legislative Assembly, has been either you've been a political bother in your party and they want to take you out of the country, or that people feel that you need a tax holiday, that you go and earn a living as a diplomat and you don't pay taxes. So either of those two. And we've been trying to say we need to get people to go and shake the East African community a little bit, shake it up. And this is not just unique to the East African community. I know the Old Boys Club in the AU, in other structures as well. They call each other the same. You call meetings, the same faces. They go by first names. They know each other's children's names and grandchildren's names as well. And some of their grandchildren are about to, I think, some of them have gotten married already now. So they are also going to have offsprings. So they know those ones as well. So they meet and talk about things like that. So we need to go and get young Africans who are committed to a different way of doing things, to a different thinking, to go to some of these structures and shake them a little bit. Huh? I think partly that to me is, the answer is, have we surrendered the space? Maybe because we don't speak loud enough, or as Professor said, some people don't take us serious enough until whatever you have said has been repeated by someone they think that should be given attention. 2, we have to work on mindsets. It's absolutely critical to work on mindsets in Africa, and you cannot work on mindsets if we do not transform our educational and cultural institutions. Those have to be targeted, and we have to show them there's a different thinking, a different way of doing things. Prof, let me share with you the words of the 15th century Swahili poet. I'll just give you a context. Mombasa has always been at war with the king, the supposedly Arab king in Zanzibar. And the king somehow got some of the elders in Mombasa to go and be lavished in Zanzibar. By the time they went to Zanzibar, they came back to Mombasa, they found the local poet had already satirized them in a poem, which had a refrain which went like this: Viwi mwaviramba vyombo, vyema mgevikulaje. In English, roughly translated, could mean when you're given good things, bad things, you eat until you lick the plates. Now, if you are given good things, how would you eat them?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think it couldn't be better in terms of rolling out the conversation, but I don't want to call it conversation or debate. I think it's deep reflections. We need to deeply reflect and do something about it through research, through action, and what we are being told as we begin this conference, we need to reflect and retrace our footsteps and do things differently. And hopefully, by the 3rd day, each one of us will have a research agenda or an action agenda. Thank you very much.
Thank you.